start, my name is Tom Ulanowski. I'm the chair of the C45 Quality Association. And on behalf of our board and our association, and of course, Labstat, our presenter, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us for this important webinar. I'll give you a quick overview of what the C45 Quality Association does, chat a bit about Labstat, and do some housekeeping before we get on with the event here. So the C45 Quality Association is a non-profit membership-backed organization that represents the quality, regulatory, and lab testing professionals in the legal cannabis industry in Canada. We were started about 3 years ago by people that were working directly with license holders or testing labs. Some of those actually have moved on to work for Health Canada. But you know, we have a number of kind of different mandates that we hope to bring to the table. The primary one is advocating for reasonable regulations. So we do that by doing education and outreach, meeting with our regulators, primarily Health Canada. We just had a meeting with 10 senior directors and officials of the cannabis branch at Health Canada, which is wonderful. So we get to provide that feedback from the perspective of our members that work day in, day out in this industry. We also do webinars such as these, more formal webinars. Sometimes they're exclusive to members, sometimes they're open to the public. And of course, we do some other kind of networking sessions. We do a quality time series, which is kind of an informal ask me anything every few weeks that people can kind of come hang out in. And of course, we do an annual summit. That's kind of how this organization first came to be. But with COVID, of course, it's been a little difficult. So we've decided to postpone it again this year. Our in-person summit, we're hoping to kind of do a virtual version in some capacity this spring or summer. So more on that after. But if you are interested in C45, if you work in cannabis, if you're a quality assurance person, professional, work in lab testing, regulations, consulting, please check us out. Our membership continues to grow, and the more members we have, the more reach we have with the regulator, and of course, with just public outreach in general. So thanks again. When it comes to this specific webinar, we are presenting this with Labstat. Labstat is a company that was established in 1976, so a couple of years ago. And it's one of the largest independent testing labs looking at kind of analytical chemistry, toxicology, microbiology for the tobacco, nicotine, cannabis, hemp, natural health products, and food industries. So there's 30 labs located across Canada, and they've been kind of at the forefront of the whole kind of e-cigarette vapor thing. And now, obviously, I would say leading the pack here in Canada anyways on the cannabis vapor kind of testing protocols. And that's what we'll be focusing on today. So before I introduce our presenter here, I hope everyone you can hear me and see me, but just a few housekeeping items. This presentation is about 45 minutes. Throughout the presentation, please, if you have any questions or comments, put them in the Q&A box on your Zoom account. What will that'll enable us to basically field questions after the event. And then there's no hard stop, but we should have at least 15 to 30 minutes where all of you can pose questions directly to our presenter, Peter. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Peter here. Peter, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Peter is Labstat's Chief Scientific Advisor, and he's also a fellow member of the Association for Chemical Professionals of Ontario. Peter tells me he's worked for Labstat for a couple of years, over 20 or 30. And so he's been at the forefront when it comes to kind of the nicotine side, the vapor side, and of course now the cannabis side, which we'll be talking about today. So he was also Chief Technical Officer. He's presented at 40 international conferences, has co-authored 10 peer-reviewed publications, and he's an active member of too many organizations to list, but his bio is available online if you want to dig in further. So Peter, without further ado, I'll hand it off to you. Thank you so much once again for presenting, and good luck on the presentation.
Okay, thanks. And I'll just start sharing my screen. So I'm going to assuming everybody can see the presentation there, Tom?
Not yet, no.
How about now?
Not yet, Peter. It worked during rehearsal.
I know. You're on screen 1. Here, I'm just going to escape. Go again. Share.
There we go.
And go into slideshow mode.
Perfect. I see it. I'm sure everyone else does.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everybody for attending this presentation and really showing some interest in developing protocols for standardized vape testing as it relates to cannabis vape products. This presentation is really a combination of 2 presentations that we've made in the past, addressing testing of cannabis vape products beyond their liquid components and addressing the importance of aerosol testing that was presented in our vape primer. And this is now combined with information presented by Arnaud and myself last spring at C45 regarding Labstat and Blink's collaboration in conducting a vape survey to better understand cannabis vaping behavior. So this information can be used to rationalize or justify vaping parameters used in the testing of cannabis vape products and eventually used in the testing of those vape products, leading to standardization and eventually lead to the way aerosol tests are being performed. So currently, there's no regulations requiring aerosol testing of cannabis vape products in Canada. Now, this could be considered a problem because the general lack of regulatory guidance can create potential risk for both product makers, the consumers, and the regulatory agencies alike. However, aerosol testing is necessary to get a better understanding of how the product itself performs. We often call this good product stewardship. In doing so, we're really trying to answer 2 fundamental questions. The first being, is the product performing the way it's designed? So are we delivering the compounds of interest as intended? And in the case of cannabis vape products, are we delivering the cannabinoids or the terpenes the way we believe the product should be behaving? The second fundamental question is, are we potentially generating unintended compounds? So these are formations of additional toxicants during use. So part of the vaping process is really heating up the e-liquid or the cannabis liquid for creating the vaporization or creating the aerosol. And as it has been reported, is that some of the terpenes during that heating process can decompose and generate things like benzene. So these are basically these unintended compounds. Now, however, for aerosol testing, it's necessary to get an understanding of how the products really perform. And we really call that good product stewardship. Beyond the good product stewardship, we all know and expect that there will eventually be regulations for aerosol testing or for the aerosols generated from cannabis vaping products. So there's no point in really burying our head in the sand. And as an example, in the state of Colorado, that all marijuana concentrates in vaporized delivery devices must be tested for heavy metal contaminants emitted in the aerosol. But we don't necessarily need to forge a whole new path in aerosol testing. Ideally, we'll want to take advantage of the lessons learned from the tobacco or the nicotine space. There are a few things to acknowledge, that the primary point being that results obtained through standardized smoking procedures are suitable for manufacturing quality assurance and ranking brand yields. This is not intended to mimic human smoking behavior. It's an important thing to understand that smoking or puffing parameters used through standardized smoking procedures like the puff volume, the puff duration, and the puff interval, or the time between puffs, should be established within ranges of human smoking or puffing. Human smoking behavior has been studied by many researchers in industry and government alike for decades when it comes to tobacco products. And I can't help but emphasize that values obtained from these analyses are not intended to forecast mainstream smoke yields for an individual smoker, as these vary among smokers and any individual smoker on different occasions. So this has been recognized by the tobacco industry and regulatory bodies for tobacco. Unfortunately, we don't have this type of data available, or there is very little data available for cannabis vape usage, being that this is a relatively new product segment. For cannabis vape usage, we need to first determine what are the real life usage patterns that we're expecting. And from there, we want to establish testing conditions to generate an aerosol in a reproducible and relevant manner. This requirement goes beyond the need for testing, but is necessary to provide a consistent consumer experience with that particular product. The purpose of conducting the vape survey was to fill these knowledge gaps, such that we could justify or rationalize the testing conditions that could be used with standardized testing of emissions. And inevitably, this could be used in the development of regulatory guidance. This information is extremely important, so important that we conducted a survey funded as a collaboration between the Blink Group and Labstat, working with Abacus Data to collect information for more than 2,000 medical and adult use consumers across Canada and the US. This was in approximately a 50-50 split between Canada and the US. And this information was gathered from self-identified users of cannabis vape products. And all of that data is self-reported. So again, this is self-reporting data. So it's not as if this was done in a controlled area where people were monitoring how other people were vaping. This is all self-reported data. As we look at the results, we see some differences between the Canadian and US consumer regarding the preferred formats that are used. So what we had as a strategy was to ask a series of questions that would allow us to make inferences to profile cannabis vaping behavior. This included questions regarding their vaping frequency. So how many times or sessions per day they were having, what their preference was in a formula ratio with regards to THC and CBD. Was it a high THC or a 1-to-1 balance? When individuals are having a vaping session, what we wanted to look at is how many puffs they would take during a vaping session and what was really the intensity of the draw. Asking questions about how long their cartridge life lasted, could give us information as what we were expecting as to how much aerosol would be delivered. And there was other relevant use and demographic details that were gathered in here that we could look at for future use into looking at how products themselves are designed for males, females, for different age groups as well. As we look at the results here, we see some differences between the Canadian and US consumer. However, when we look at the formats, we see that in the top 4 results from both sides, that joints, edibles, vape pens, and blunts are basically the 4 preferred formats in both countries. Also, in both countries, it just does demonstrate that vape pens are a significant format for cannabis consumption. However, it is a more dominant format in the US compared to Canada. The profile of the average cannabis vape consumer is presented here, showing some additional differences between Canadian and US consumers. So 1 in 4 Canadians vape cannabis, particularly men under 30. So 25%, that's a higher percentage when we look at the US consumer. 57% predominantly vape for adult use purposes in Canada, with about half self-describing themselves as occasional users on a monthly basis or less, and half doing so more frequently. Where in the US, 34% predominantly vape for adult use purposes, though many use them for medicinal uses as well. Most of them describe themselves as intermediate vapers, meaning that they are vaping on a weekly or more frequent interval. Here again, just like what it was on the first slide, we saw differences in the preferred formats, with Canadians preferring joints while Americans preferred vape pens. This may be partially due to legalization or the social acceptance of cannabis usage in Canada, where it's not really necessary to conceal cannabis usage. Where in the US, where vape pens, they would be more difficult to distinguish from their nicotine counterparts. However, what we'll see is that Canadians and Americans seem to agree on their preferred THC CBD ratio, either preferring a high THC and low CBD split or a balanced split between THC and CBD. This slide shows the frequency of use per day. And here we're seeing that that cannabis use is significant on a daily basis, with the usage of multiple usage per day being much higher in Americans than we do Canadians. But again, cannabis vape usage is significant on a daily basis. From here, we also started to look at the number of sessions per day, because this is provides us with some important insight into determining what is the total consumption of cannabis vape over the life of a cartridge. So if a person is having fewer sessions per day over a longer series of days, we know that they are consuming less on a per day basis. We also looked at the number of puffs per session. which also provides us further insight on the total consumption or the total delivery profile, allowing us to make some predictions on delivery rates. So for example, in the US, there is, and in Canada, predominantly sessions are in the 2 to 5 puff range. Another important factor in estimating or predicting what the total consumption was looking at the cartridge life. So how many days a cartridge lasts on average. This information, combined with the previous information on the number of puffs per session and the number of sessions, allows us to dig deeper in estimating the total consumption and deliveries. Here we ask the consumer to provide an estimate of how many puffs they would expect to take from a 500 milligram cartridge. Of course, not all consumers use a 0.5 gram cartridge. So this becomes more of a reality check as to how good the survey participants are in estimating in their estimations and their real awareness of how they have been using the vaping products. We also ask the consumer about their preferred vaping format, as well as the size or loading of the cannabis product. Again, we are using average information in an attempt to predict the consumption from the cannabis product. So as we begin to piece all this together, so we're piecing all this average information together related to the sessions per day, puffs per session, days a cartridge lasts, along with our experience that not the entire loading or mass of a cartridge is really transferred to the aerosol. And it's been our experience that at best, we're usually transferring 80% of the loading to aerosol before a device stops functioning properly. So we can make some assumptions or predictions as to how many puffs a cartridge would last. This provides a relatively broad range of 109 to 184 puffs relative to a 0.5 gram cartridge. Now, although that's a pretty broad range, again, this is all based on self-reported data and people making assumptions of their own behavior. So to this point, we've estimated expectations of how much aerosol by mass should be delivered. To establish a puffing regime, we also need to consider the length of draw. This was estimated to be between 3.9 and 4.3 seconds. Now, please note that there's some estimations that really seem to be unrealistic in the sense that many participants reported puff durations of greater than 10 seconds. Now, for me, this is hard to believe, but you have to really work with the data that we have in this situation. We also asked the participants as a qualitative question regarding the intensity of their puff on a scale of 1 to 5. This is somewhat of a surrogate to the anticipated average puff volume that we were expecting to see. With these anticipated deliveries calculated and projected to a 500 milligram cartridge, we should expect an average puffing regimen to yield between 2.5 and 5 milligrams of aerosol mass per puff. Again, this is all based on averaged self-reported data. So in proposing a puffing regimen, there's a number of key elements that we need to use. It's the puff volume, the puff duration, and our experience has demonstrated it through the work with nicotine products and with vaping products that the puff duration itself has the largest impact on deliveries per puff. The puff frequency itself has a very small influence. So the puff frequency is generally tailored to be a 30-second frequency, which provides enough time between puffs so there is some cooling down between puffs so you're not overheating a device, as well as it enables, from a testing perspective, enough time or a short enough time period so you can collect enough puffs in order to make good quantitative analysis. Now, there's a few additional factors that we need to take into consideration, and that is basically a technical understanding of the harmonization between the device and the formulation and the resulting vapor. So we know that some liquids will work well in certain devices and not work in others, or the converse. You know, some devices can handle a series of liquids, but there's certain things that where they end up leaking and creating a lot of problems. We also have to consider the desire or the need to compare deliveries within a similar product segment. And this is having the capability to compare against nicotine delivery systems or ENDS devices. And I know a lot of people will say, well, why would we want to compare ourselves against ENDS? Because these are cannabis products, these are very different. However, since the technology is predominantly the same as in nicotine delivery systems, there will always be a desire to compare the deliveries when it comes to deliveries of undesirable or compounds like the harmful and potentially harmful compounds that could be generated when a device overheats. So with the proposed puffing regimen, we know that in ENDS devices, basically the baseline ENDS puffing regime is a 55-3-30. Now, this puff duration is lower than what we had anticipated as the average puff duration for a cannabis product. But we need to also keep in mind that that is an average based on self-reported data. So by having a shorter duration, we are looking at more of the lower end deliveries, or what I would call the cannabis baseline. That also gives a direct comparison to the nicotine delivery systems, which are also being tested at that same puffing regime. We would also expect that for cannabis, there should be a more intensive puffing regime, something that's greater than the 55 mils, looking at somewhere between 80 and 110 mils, and a larger duration than the 3 seconds, somewhere in the ballpark of 4 to 5. And a lot of that consideration of the intensive regime, we need to take into consideration the product design and looking at the harmonization between the device settings, and the formulation. And now here I'm going to give a bunch of examples related to how certain devices are performing under, say, the 55-3-30 puffing regime. In this case, It was analysis using a hemp seed oil, the same hemp seed oil in 4 different products. One was a prototype, another was a tank system, a disposable device, as well as then a cartomizer or a cartridge device. 9 replicates were performed for each product type, and we were doing 50 puff collections. And here it's very easy to see that there's extreme variability across the entire product segment. So looking at the worst case variability in the prototype, there was deliveries of aerosol ranging from 0.2 to up to 1.65 milligrams per puff. So a huge, huge amount of variability. In the best situation, the cartridge was still going from 0.1 up to 0.6 milligrams per puff delivery. So we have 2 issues here. One is the extreme variability, and the other being that the delivery for these devices with this hemp seed oil combination was delivering far less than what we anticipated based on the survey results. As we move into example 2, we see some more consistency. Here we've got a high THC content oil, again, using the same puffing regime. This was the same device that was being tested in 50 puff increments over a series of collection segments to look at the consistency of the performance of the device. Here we were having 7 replicates being performed. Now on one of the replicates, we can see that it was extremely variable, had the higher deliveries in the first 3 collection segments that are reported here out into 300 puffs, which is 6 collection segments. And then it finished or reached its end of life considerably earlier with having very low deliveries. Another replicate had shown a relatively high amount of delivery at the beginning, and it had a consistent drop in its delivery profile until it reached its end around 850 puffs. And the third replicate showed relatively consistent delivery throughout the process, and really not completely reaching its end of life at 850 puffs. But what we can also see when we look at the data, overall, the delivery was, again, lower than anticipated based on the survey information that we had, as well as increased variability throughout the life cycle of the cartridge. So this is another example of poor consistency of a product, which could result in poor customer satisfaction. Now here's an example where we have greater harmonization. Again, the 55-330 puffing regime. This is a mid content THC content oil. Was a different type of device with the cartridge. We were doing 50 puff collections going out to 4 collection segments or 200 puffs. Now, one of the replicates had an extremely high delivery at the beginning, and it was depleted considerably faster than the rest of the replicates. However, the other 6 replicates showed a pattern that what we would expect from a well-harmonized product. So for the first 2 to 3 collection segments, so 75% of the life of the cartridge was relatively consistent, looking at deliveries of 2.62 to 2.68 down to 2.29 milligrams per puff. Again, these are now within the range that we anticipated from our survey. And in the final collection segment, the last quarter of the product, we see that the delivery is slowly depleted and we're getting greater variability. But this is more of a profile that we would expect in having relatively consistent delivery across the replicates. Now here we have an example of a more intensive regime. We've kept the puff duration the same, but using a more intensive draw. So this was looking at 2 device types and 5 THC CBD formulations. So we've got 2 oils in device A and 3 oils in device B. The end of life was roughly between 150 and 200 puffs. This shows really just the first 50 puff collection. In essence, we did 11 different tests looking for different components in the harmful and potentially harmful compounds, as well as THC and terpenes. So this gives us an average of 33 replicates per device and oil combination. So here we see on device A, where we're looking at 2 different oils. This is a box whisker plot showing basically the range as well as the median as the line on the box, and relatively consistent deliveries amongst all 33 replicates for device A on the one oil as well as the other, well within our range of what we were expecting for delivery of 2.79 milligrams per puff and 2.46 milligrams per puff. As we go to device B, looking at 3 different oils, also showing relatively consistent deliveries in the puff segment with relative standard deviations ranging from 12.7 up to 17.8%. Deliveries within our expected range, even though the third oil itself had generally a lower delivery on device B compared to the other 2 oils. So this provides an example of relatively well-harmonized oils with the device delivering aerosol at levels that we anticipated from the survey. So here's our survey summary. We have to keep in mind that all this data from the survey is self-reported. And in essence, as we do more product research and product development, the data really should be validated through additional research by doing some real topography testing, basically what has been used in the nicotine space for years. There's like a CREST system that monitors the duration of the puff volume, and the number of puffs that are being taken during a session. The survey and our proposed puffing regimens really are a first step in the standardization process, in that the vape testing protocol is required to ensure products are tested really to the highest quality, in that they really do provide some meaningful results. So from here, we're really trying to build a testing protocol for cannabis vaping products. So what we'll try to do is breaking this down into phases that are simple and cost effective to understand. So the first phase is simply looking at the device performance. So the device performance was simply looking at the device mass loss and the aerosol collected mass on during testing. Because if you find that the aerosol collected mass varies significantly, there may need to be design changes in the product, either reharmonizing the liquid with the device such that you can get consistent performance. That, in essence, would be the cheapest analysis and being the most cost-effective analysis to determine whether your device is consistently performing and generating a consistent consumer experience. The second phase would be the dose delivery. So is the device delivering what it's supposed to be delivering? So would we be looking at the cannabinoid profile to determine how the liquid being used is being transferred to the aerosol, and does that cannabinoid profile remain consistent for the entire life cycle of that cartridge or vaping device? Another aspect for dose delivery, which could impact flavor and again the consumer experience, would be looking at the terpene profile to see if really flavor itself could change over the life as you've got more volatile things potentially distilling over more quickly than the heavier terpenes. And then once you have the product stewardship done to the point where you're delivering a consistent amount of aerosol, you're delivering a consistent amount of the components that you're intending to deliver, then phase 3 would be looking at additional compounds of interest, like the harmful and potentially harmful compounds. So each phase builds on the knowledge from the previous phase to develop a technical understanding of the harmonization between the device, the formulation, and the resulting vapor. Phase 1, again repeated, device performance. The aims to determine if the vape device consistently delivers the amount of aerosol intended. And that's as demonstrated in those previous examples that we've shown. Another important aspect of this is really understanding the device-to-device variability. So even though there may be certain instances where we think that the harmonization between the device and the liquid is appropriate, we may see large device-to-device variability. Phase 2, again, how well the vape device delivers the intended compounds, the cannabinoid deliveries and the terpene deliveries. So here we can assess total deliveries and or consistent delivery patterns over the life cycle of an individual cartridges or filling, or looking at, again, the device-to-device variability. Phase 3, the additional compounds, looking at the unintended compounds that could be generated that may not be found originally in the liquids. And when we talk about the requirements in Colorado, are we looking at compounds leaching from the device itself, like metals, which can end up into the aerosol? Do we look at compounds formed through atomization, through heating, the heating process in the device, like the degradants of terpenes, And I gave an example earlier of looking at volatiles like benzene. So in the absence of any prescribed guidance for cannabis vape aerosol testing, a reasonable list to start to pick away for compounds of interest could be inferred from the US FDA guidance for harmful and potentially harmful constituents as they're applied to the nicotine delivery systems. Of course, this category will continue to evolve as additional compounds that impact human health are identified. So for example, 2019, there was the vitamin E acetate. That was an issue that required testing of products to look at vitamin E acetate delivered into aerosol. And it also was required in some instances in the nicotine space to be looking for vitamin E acetate. One of the major differences here is in the nicotine space, primarily the carrier of the nicotine is a propylene glycol glycerol mix. That in itself, when overheated, can generate certain compounds. In the cannabis space, there are different carriers. Some will just use a distillate with a mix of terpenes, where things that are specifically degradants of glycerin or propylene glycol may not be required for testing. However, I think it's always important to first demonstrate that on at least a small sample set. In summary, given the device range of devices and extracts, your testing plan really needs to be tailored to the specific parameters of the device, the extract, and the consumer behavior. So if you've got a device that is really intended to have very long puffs and you've harmonized the liquid to that device, testing should be conducted to meet those, the way the product is designed. Using this phased approach, it's flexible, that allows product developers to halt testing at any time if there are product-related issues. That inevitably would save both time and money compared to saying, if we have a product, we want to do the full array of tests and finding out that the delivery performance is inconsistent, thus producing really unreliable results or results that really cannot be used to determine how well the product is performing. So, and because what we say is that reliable and robust analytical results are necessary for both product developers, end users, and potentially any of the regulators who are looking at regulating these products. So I'd like to thank you for your attention, and willing to start taking on any questions.
Thanks, Peter. That was very fascinating. Thank you again for that. And for those that joined in a little late, yes, we have are recording this, and we'll likely be posting it on our YouTube channel in the next few weeks. And then also in the chat, I posted a link to Labstat's website, which includes a download for the survey results, essentially as presented. So if anyone wants kind of to go over the slides again, I would kind of refer them to that, and I added the link on our events page on our website. So Peter, we have a number of questions, and we'll kind of take them one by one, and I encourage everyone else that's still on here, and there's many of you, to definitely post your questions. And I see some of you are coming from the perspective of the US, because you're US based, some of are coming from Canada. But I guess I'll just kick it off quickly and kind of before we delve in here. And also, if you want to ask a question to our audience, if you want to ask a question on the mic, just click raise your hand on Zoom there, and then I'll see if I can get to you and enable your mic. But where we're at now, Peter, is here in Canada, cannabis vapes are legal and have been for, I believe, 2 years, a little over. Right now, the regulations specific to vapes are very scant. I mean, there's really nothing there, right? It says you can't have more than 1,000 milligrams of THC. It's got to meet some pharmacopoeia standards for quality. But they don't at all discuss vapor testing. They don't really, prevent anyone from adding non-cannabis derived terpenes or flavors. They don't talk about any specific standards that those flavors should meet. There's a lot of factors that one has to consider when testing vapes, because what you've established here is you've kind of narrowed down a regime or regimen to kind of conduct some vape testing, right? And that's important. But there's different formulations, right? We have distillate-based vapes that could be unflavored. They can have botanically derived flavors or cannabis-derived flavors. They can have PG or VG in it. There's live resin or kind of, cannabis only, but very kind of aromatic formulations. There's different hardware, heating elements. There's different airflow rates, different temperatures and voltages, the age of the product. All that is to say is, in my mind, that presents, like, all these factors are going to make it very difficult for any regulator to say, or any producer to kind of tackle these all these factors. How would you approach that as someone kind of on the testing side? Given all these different variables, if you're a regulator, like what would you focus on most?
So from a product stewardship and a regulatory side, I think what you want to be able to first establish is really what is being delivered to the consumer. The liquid that's in the device isn't being delivered to the consumer. It's really the aerosol itself that's being delivered to the consumer. So once we've established that, from a product stewardship side, I need to make sure that what is being delivered to the consumer is consistent. So how do I harmonize the liquid with the hardware that I'm using? And under what conditions is that aerosol going to be developed? Well, I think for a baseline, because a lot of the hardware is consistent with that is being used for nicotine products, we should take into consideration that nicotine products are already being tested under this 55330. Now, so I would anticipate that my product should at least be able to handle those conditions without creating a problem. I can still generate a consistent aerosol. I'm not creating any real problems with that. Now, if I've also got design considerations that I know that my product will be used more intensively, longer durations, a larger puff volume, and that's the way I've designed my product, I would want to make sure that the product itself performs consistently under that condition as well. Now, we already have examples in the nicotine space, and it's with the harmful and potentially harmful compounds in the end space, that has the base 55330 and a more intensive regime from a regulatory perspective. That more intensive regime is not fully prescribed. And And my belief is it is not prescribed simply because the hardware, the liquids, there's so much variability that could be intense for one product is really not intense for another product. So I think it's important that people understand their product design so they can test under both, that their product design and harmonization works under that baseline puffing regime and the more intensive regime. You are correct right now that the aerosol itself is not regulated. However, I think from a product stewardship, I think it's important to say, is my consumer getting a consistent consumer experience? If not, if they're buying one product, say, hey, this is great. And then the next day or the next week, they go out and buy another cartridge and it says, well, this one sucks. It's not working that great. It's not delivering. Are they going to continue to try that product, or are they going to move to a different product? We know that eventually the regulatory environment will come in testing aerosols. It's already started, as it says in Colorado. It's only a matter of time. So it's a matter of, are you in it for the long haul? And are you going to be prepared so you know as much about your product? That regulation does not scare you. That regulation is actually embraced to keep other people out of the market and getting into your space. It all depends how you're going to look at it.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I would also suspect at some point here in Canada, we would see that, but as the vapor testing component, but I think the first step that everyone's kind of waiting for more information is looking at Health Canada's proposed flavor amendments to flavorings, right? So, and I just, before we move on, I'll just kind of pitch that we are kind of doing a follow-up on this event on February 23rd, I believe, at 5 p.m. Eastern. Myself, Dr. Shane Morris, and Deepak Anand, who's actually got a few questions up here as well. We're going to be discussing that in our Quality Time webinar. So I encourage everyone that's interested in that proposed regulation to join that event. Before we get to questions, and they're streaming in, I just have one question for you. In your graphs, generally, there was a decrease in aerosol delivery, regardless of hardware or formulation over time.
Yeah.
What is, in your opinion, or if you can have some insight on this, what is going on there? Why are we seeing that? Is that the heating element itself that's just getting coated or losing power, or like why is that consistent?
Yeah. So I doubt it has anything to do with the heating element, although that could contribute. My belief is that it's primarily driven by the volume of liquid that is in the tank and that mass, how quickly it's wicked to get to the atomizer. So when you're wicking a small amount, I guess you could assume kind of like your shop vac. You take your shop vac to a bucket of water, it sucks it up really quick, but then you got those last little bits that where the water kind of bubbles through and it's not sucking it up as great. I think it's more of the wicking nature as the amount of liquid in the cartridge or consumable is being used up.
Interesting. So it's like a mass flow issue rather than like a hardware failure. Okay, great. Okay, we'll start on the Q&A box. I don't know if you have the Q&A box in front of you. We have a few questions there. A few of them are in the chat box, and then at least one person has raised their hand. So we'll start with the Q&A. Debbie Miran asks or comments, last week, Pennsylvania ordered the recall of 18 pages of cannabis products for inhalation. This recall was based on a statewide review of all inhalation products and the inactive ingredients contained therein. And we know that Health Canada is moving to a similar direction. So, not necessarily related to puffing regimes, but of course, this is ultimately what ends up, the ingredients in the product end up being atomized or vaporized. So can you kind of discuss what your thoughts are, maybe what Pennsylvania was thinking, or where Health Canada is headed? It seems to me that before we get into vapor testing, they're kind of stopping it right at the source and saying, here's a list of things you can't or shouldn't add to your vape. And here's a list of stuff that's okay. In Health Canada's perspective, that's anything that resembles a molecule that's found in cannabis. So I don't know, just any thoughts on kind of what you think about Pennsylvania or Health Canada's proposed regulations?
Well, it seems to be a reasonable approach of first trying to control what gets into the vape product. So if they have a list of things that are deemed to be not allowed to be in the liquid, testing for that, I think, is a no-brainer. Once we've got to the point where the liquid contains things that everything's allowed, we want to make sure that during the aerosolization process, we're not converting anything of those allowed components to create harmful and potentially harmful compounds. So for example, yeah, we're allowed to have terpenes. And I'm not sure at what temperature this occurs, certain terpenes can decompose and create benzene. Well, of course, they're allowing terpenes in there, so you're not going to eliminate terpenes, but then you have to look at, okay, what is being delivered to the consumer? And if those terpenes are breaking down through my aerosolization process, do I need to adjust my aerosolization process? Either the aerosolization temperature, the rate of wicking, however it is, to prevent the formation of things like benzene. And I use benzene as an example, but it could be any other harmful or potentially harmful compound.
For sure, that's just the most common one, and I suspect a lot of that comes from the nicotine.
It was one that I just read on yesterday, so
okay, it's
at the top of my list right now.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think what happened in Pennsylvania is likely in some capacity or some form to happen in Health Canada when and if these new proposed vape regulations in Canada come in. But at the same time, the conundrum is cannabis is a very aromatically diverse plant. It naturally contains these dozens, if not hundreds, of terpenes and other aromatic compounds. So it's very difficult for any regulator to ban a molecule that exists naturally in a product that you're allowed to sell. Because a molecule is a molecule, whether it comes from cannabis or another plant that you derive it from, or even synthesize, in the lab. But at the end of the day, I think, we all as an industry need to be aware that these products they're a cocktail of ingredients. They're not a single, molecule.
Yeah, so I think if you kind of look at it as with that cocktail, you've got a number of compounds in there, but in a cannabis product, those compounds or those terpenes would be in certain ratios that resemble a cannabis plant. So you can get those terpenes from anywhere, combine them in those ratios. But if you kind of focus on only a couple terpenes, that gives a completely different profile from what would be cannabis. I think that's what they are trying to prevent from happening.
Yeah.
And, testing the liquids in advance is just kind of like, we had the vitamin E acetate issue back in 2019 or 2018. All the years kind of run together as I get older. But, so I think they're really trying to prevent any of that happening, but also preventing a formulations that, oh, well, this compound is found naturally in cannabis, so I should be able to use it. But if it's in a disproportionately high ratio, that makes it taste like caramel.
You know, to play devil's advocate a bit, I mean, especially in Canada, the way that Health Canada is kind of going with this, I think from a chemist perspective, one can argue that using a variety of extraction, refinement, and purification technologies, you can take something that in cannabis is only found in 1 or 2% by weight, and you can concentrate that to 80-90%, like we do with THC or CBD and distillates. So then, you know, I think anyone that wanted to push back on that would say, well, you know, it's just my extraction methodology that determines my chemical constituents at the end. And if I want my product to contain 50% limonene, so be it, right? I mean, so it's a lot tougher for the regulator, in my opinion, to ban or limit certain non-THC or cannabinoid molecules or chemicals because of how diverse the cannabis plant is, right? And you don't have that issue necessarily with nicotine or tobacco. So Deepak has questions that kind of relate to that, and Deepak here, who's joining us for this Quality Town webinar in a few weeks, and he's been in the space here in Canada for a while, and launched companies overseas as well. He asked, can you speak to the relative safety profile of vaping minor cannabinoids and terpenes? And I guess, you know, this is all along the same lines. As we have this cocktail of ingredients, we focus on THC or CBD as an industry, or even the regulator, because of their intoxicating or pharmacological effects. But clearly these compounds or these products contain minor cannabinoids. Are you aware of any resources, either standards or pharmacopoeia or publication that speak to safety profiles of these major and minor cannabinoids and terpenoids that can help a producer when they're doing their own testing, or a regulator when they're looking to make regulations kind of inform what's good versus what isn't from a safety profile?
Yeah, I think I always worry when we start using the word of a safety profile. I think a lot of the terminology used, at least in the nicotine space, was a modified risk. So reducing the risk potentially. Now, when it comes to aerosol, I think breathing in anything other than air always has some risk associated with it. I don't know. I'm not a doctor or anything from that area to really provide any guidance in a risk assessment based on the toxicology of the aerosol that's being generated. Our expertise really lies in what is the best way to generate an aerosol in a consistent and meaningful manner. So the people like the toxicologists can look at the data and determine whether they should be making changes to formulation or changes to product design in order to potentially reduce the risk of their product in comparison to other products. Oh, Deepak has his hand up again.
Thanks, Peter. Appreciate all of the information. So my question really comes from, I've had a number of conversations with some very large, big tobacco companies in the space, and their comments to me back have been, we will absolutely not touch any cannabinoids outside of CBD and THC as isolated compounds, kind of, mixed with PGVG. What are your thoughts on the relative safety profile then of CBD and THC specifically as isolated compounds, and mixing those with something like PGVG? Is there, the information that I got back from that call with that group was they feel very comfortable with CBD and THC specifically and PGVG. Can you comment on that and just provide some updates on either the research or what your thoughts are on that?
Well,
Thanks, Deepak.
so partially because the hardware that's generally used in these devices is similar to what's being used in the nicotine space. And having an aerosol carrier like PGVG, propylene glycol or glycerin, in any combination is really a much more consistent and I believe a more controllable measure for or liquid for aerosol delivery. That doesn't mean other things can do equally as good of a job, but there's been, I think, extensive research in the nicotine space using propylene glycol and glycerin as the carrier that, say, someone like in the nicotine space is very comfortable with doing product or device design changes to work with the propylene glycol and glycerin. They can work with different heating profiles, trying to limit the amount of carbonyls that may be formed. In general, the propylene glycol glycerin ratio can impact how soluble some of the flavors that are in the e-liquid, how well they dissolve into the PGVG mixture itself. Yeah, so I think basically it's a matrix that they are comfortable with for using as a delivery mechanism of the compounds of intended delivery. So when we're talking about using, say, a cannabinoid distillate with a terpene really as the solvent to cut it, now you're talking a larger number of compounds that can have a slightly different impact at different temperatures in the device and potentially different wicking parameters. But when we're looking at PGVG, CBD, and THC, when we're talking 4 compounds to really monitor and have your device development such that you're minimizing the potential of creating other decomposition products, I think it seems to be a reasonable strategy. I don't think it's the only strategy, but I think that's when you're talking to people like in big tobacco, that is something that they're comfortable to work with. And we all like to work with something that we're comfortable with.
Yeah. Thanks, Deepak. And thanks, Peter. Peter, how are you doing for time? You still have time? There's a lot of questions.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Okay. And
as long as they're not boring people too much, that's okay.
No, we've still got well over 40 people here listening, and I think the questions keep coming in. So I'll unmute our next person who's been patiently waiting, Shahid, in a second. But I will just say, when it comes to the PGVG thing, it's interesting because clearly there's a history now of the e-cigarette industry using that as a matrix, and it performs very well. It solves the viscosity issue that THC or CBD distillates generally have when it comes to hardware. But for many reasons, the cannabis consumer does not, at least here in Canada, generally does not want that in their matrix, right? They just want cannabis or only cannabis and maybe botanically derived terpenes. So just a comment, it will be interesting to see how that evolves when companies, perhaps from the tobacco industry, kind of continue to move into this space, how they will develop products that they're comfortable with versus what the consumer wants, and how those kind of things will mesh together. But it's still early days, of course.
Yeah. Well, I think the industry will look at developing only products that the consumer wants, because if it's not making them money, they're not going to be making it. So,
yeah, the customer is always right in knowing what they want, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
I thought I saw Arnaud on the in the chat as well.
Yes.
I don't know if maybe Arnaud may even have some perspective on here. So Arnaud's Demas Raleigh, he's been with the Blink group, part of the survey. So I don't know if Arnaud, if you wanted to have any comments regarding that as well.
I can unmute Arnaud.
Hello.
Hi, Arnaud.
Hey, Peter, how are you?
Not too bad. So I don't know if you heard some of the questions earlier.
Oh, no, I did. I was actually answering the Pennsylvania question about what's going on, and I shared a link on the chat with all the quote unquote additives that Pennsylvania has been looking at to initiate that recall. The problem is, if they're looking for FDA approved ingredients for inhalation, then they're just not going to see any because there aren't any.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, I think a lot of these ingredients on that link are currently present in the plant. So if we take this really, and this is just interpretation, they're just looking at these ingredients not to be added, but for instance, making live resin, if you separate the terpenes and add them back, is that considered adding? For regulators, and given the past history in nicotine vaping, I believe they consider that as added back in, which is why there's a lot of live resin products that have been recalled in what happened in Pennsylvania. But that's really it. I answered the questions, Peter. Good job. You answered everything. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thanks, Arnaud. Appreciate that. And Shahid, you've been patiently waiting. So please, your hand is up and you have the mic.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes,
we can hear
you. Okay. So my question, it's not a question. I just want Peter expert opinion on, because there are two aspects. So far, the discussion that has been happened so far is on the quality side. But what happens, suppose we have a serious adverse reaction, for example, Valley, all, because we have been talking about vitamin A acetate, so Valley, and now we are trying to do some sort of causality assessment. And we have a product at issue in hand. So there are three kinds of products. Once the product the patient was using, and we can also obtain a product from the company. But when we talk about correlation, when we talk about causal association, whether or not the product has any contributory role, I personally feel that we should not be analyzing we should be analyzing the control product plus patient's product. But I think the most important things to analyze is aerosol, because that is the one is the patient is being exposed to. So, and based on your presentation, I realized there's so many variation in terms of puff volume, the intensity, the how long they're. So I don't know, what's your opinion on when we are talking about risk assessment? I'm not asking about safety profile. So what do you think in order to do the risk assessment, do we need to analyze how important to, and let me put my question in a different way, how important to analyze the aerosol rather than to analyze the patient's open sample or the control sample you obtain from the same lot from the company? I hope my question was clear. Thank you.
Well, yeah, I believe it's important to analyze the aerosol because that is what the individual consumer is being exposed to. Now, how that aerosol is generated is what we were trying to discuss here, is that there's inevitably a baseline that products should be able to deliver a consistent and reproducible amount of aerosol. Now, if your product is designed to deliver to operate under much more extreme conditions, I think it's important that the aerosol be tested under those conditions in which the device itself is designed to operate. But in order to have any meaningful results, you need to have a consistent, reproducible aerosol generation that is meaningful to the device. Now, beyond that, from the delivery profile or what is collected in the aerosol, that could be assessed by the toxicologist to look for correlations. And as we all know, correlation does not necessarily mean causation, as I've had that beaten into my head quite a bit working for a statistician for over 25 years. But I think testing the aerosol is critical in at least doing that assessment. Now, testing the liquid or the components of the solution that is used for aerosolization, I think understanding what is in that liquid and understanding the potential degradants that may occur during heating of that liquid could provide some guidance as to what unusual or unexpected compounds you may want to look at. So that would go beyond what the HPHC list is for nicotine delivery systems, especially if you know that a certain terpene, if it's overheated, creates a compound that is extremely harmful or has a high toxicity related to it. I myself am generally just involved in the testing to ensure that we can do a good sample aerosol generation, good aerosol collection and analysis. The toxicological assessment is really done by others.
Thanks, Peter. I agree. Aerosol testing beyond the constituents of the input oil or product is important. Let's talk about that for a second. We have a few questions here from Robert Thomas, from Stephanie Goldman, others in the chat, specifically focused on the metal part, or the heavy metal, or just generally the metal, right? So I mean, here in Canada, most people and in the States, they look at the kind of the top 4 heavy metals: arsenic, cadmium, lead, mercury. Others kind of go beyond that, but we do know that this hardware in these vape carts is different. But you know, they have metal components, nichrome, brass, stainless steel, what have you, that contain a variety of other metals: copper, nickel, chromium, iron, tin, aluminum. What do you see? Like, so number one, when you talk about vapor testing, what Labstat does, that's possible now, right? To do heavy metal testing of the vapor, and like what, like in your experience, what just as a follow, like what have you seen in the landscape, like how both on the nicotine side but on the cannabis side? Like, do you see a lot of metal issues that you wouldn't catch when you only test the oil?
One of the hard parts, at least in testing the aerosol, is really the low deliveries that you're looking at. So we're looking at nanogram levels of each of these elements as it's coming through into the aerosol, unless there's something dramatically wrong where you've had like something with the atomizer completely kind of like almost corrode that, or is coming through into the aerosol, where you could see some high amounts of a particular metal. Like, so if, for example, if there is a zinc component in the atomizer. One of the ways that you categorize zinc is the trace amount of lead content in there. So if that zinc component is breaking down, you may also have higher amounts of lead coming through. It is very difficult in the sense that the trace levels that we're looking for, and I'm going to use more of the nicotine experience in metals, is very difficult to distinguish from background, what you're collecting. So,
and again, that's because you're playing with kind of detection or quantitation limits because you're like on the lower end there.
Or whatever your collection substrate is. So if you're using a quartz collection pad,
right,
even though it's fine for environmental sampling where you're drawing hundreds of cubic meters through there, so you can calculate back to really trace levels per cubic meter. Those levels in the background of a quartz collection pad are usually, the variability amongst those pads is high enough that makes it difficult to make any measurement of metals unless there is a gross problem. I know that with the CDC work was using an FEP collection tube, basically where with each puff, basically it takes about 2 volumes of the 55 ml puff volume, so it kind of impacts on the side. Trying to remove the metals from that is in itself extremely difficult, and even made even more difficult in a cannabis aerosol, which is much more sticky and doesn't necessarily like to dissolve up in an aqueous medium that has some dilute nitric acid and dilute hydrochloric acid, which is great on electronic nicotine delivery systems, which is propylene glycol and glycerin that dissolves up very nicely in there. We have looked at electrostatic precipitation, which tends to work really well with combustible products and some of the heated products, dependent on the orientation and how fluid some of the aerosol that's being collected is. Sometimes that is even difficult to do. So it is great when you're identifying some gross problems. And I think that is what is primarily the intent of looking for those gross problems. When we're looking at stability studies, some of these cannabis extracts may be slightly more corrosive than, say, a PGVG matrix.
You're going to ask, that leaching and age contributing a lot to
is it leaching, changing how things are atomized and changing the whole delivery profile?
So would you say that generally, I mean, again, lots of factors, lots of variability, but are metals or heavy metals in the vapor, like, would you say they're more of an issue than maybe the creation of undesirable compounds such as benzene? Or like, if you had to kind of weigh the two based on what you've seen, like if you were a regulator, what would you want to focus on first? Would you look at, I don't know what's going in there, I can't control the terpenes, so I just focus on the heavy metals? Or would you actually say, well, generally the metals are not an issue because of the low amounts and they're hard to even quantify. Let's focus on the ingredients or the vapors.
Well, first, I'm not a toxicologist, so I don't really know what the levels of concern for delivery are when it comes to aerosol with metals. In general, what we've seen is that metals have not been a major issue. However, when a device is behaving poorly, metals can be an issue for certain compounds, and that is very device dependent. So we have seen in certain areas, and I don't know the driver behind this, as if there is the way that the wicking or the coil is fused into the system, where we have seen higher levels of mercury. Now, are those toxicological levels of mercury? I'm not sure, but they are higher than what we expect to see on background and higher than on some other products that we've seen. So I think metals are a reasonable thing to look at, primarily because of their potential to leach out of the components of the cartridge and change the performance of the cartridge.
Right. Great. Now, we're at an hour and a half here. So I think and we've kind of mostly covered all the questions. So I'm sorry for those of you that had similar questions. I've had to kind of be pick and choosy a little bit. So I will kind of ask you one more question here. And again, a little bit more of a comment or speculation thing. So, in Canada, we have a federally regulated legal industry. We've had for a number of years, adult use for over 3 now. Clearly, the regulator is looking to modify the regulations on a federal level here in Canada to prevent certain ingredients from being used. We have a situation in the States that's much different, right? And I say this with acknowledging that there's probably people at the FDA that are on this webinar now, but there's this issue in the States that it's federally illegal for the vast majority of cannabis-based products. Or we have state-by-state legalization, some medical, some adult use. But the things that we've seen happen in Pennsylvania or California, Colorado, do you think that the states have the ability, when we talk about safety, consumer safety, have the ability to really look into the issue of vapor testing or setting standards? Or is this just going to be a patchwork of laws and regulations that will not, offer any benefit to the consumer until a federal agency like the FDA is able to step in and regulate? Because, clearly some states have much lower resources, small resources. Is this just going to be whack-a-mole in the states for the foreseeable future until there's a more cohesive federal framework?
Yeah, personally, I don't see it more a whack-a-mole area at all. I think really nobody wants to reinvent the wheel. So a state that takes the lead in regulating these types of things, I would assume that people considering regulation will look at that, look at the effectiveness of it, their ability to implement it, and say, yes, this is something that is doable. Aerosol testing. Now, I've been doing this for over 31 years, so I think it's pretty easy myself. But
I would push back and say, but it's probably not, because Labstat's probably the only lab in Canada that does something like this, right?
Yeah.
So,
but it takes a commitment to resources to do it. And really that's what it is. But I don't expect it to be a patchwork. I expect it, if whoever takes the lead, people will eventually look at that regulation, look at the effectiveness, maybe only take portions of it, perhaps expand further on it. We've seen that in the tobacco industry with the Health Canada regulations initially, where Brazil basically just adopted the methodologies and what needed to be reported from the Health Canada regulations. So
So Health Canada has an opportunity, or Canada has an opportunity to set the conversation, given its position.
Have an opportunity to set the conversation, but as we said, there was the metals regulations in Colorado. There's also what the potential for other states doing something similar, perhaps expanding on it. And I think if a state that has taken the lead and another state builds on that, the first state will probably say, hey, that was also a good idea. Let's try to make this a much more consistent regulatory climate.
Okay. Peter, thank you so much. Really appreciate your insight in your wealth of knowledge, and for sharing that with us here on behalf of the C45 Quality Association. Really thank you. And of course to Labstat as well for providing this opportunity to us. Again, I will reiterate, I'm sure we can be talking for another hour or two with everyone, but at some point we need to get back to our day jobs here. But this conversation will be released in the coming weeks, likely on our YouTube channel or portions thereof for those of you that could not attend the entire conversation today. There's the study that I linked to on our events website that kind of provides a summary of what you talked about. And I think all of you will also get a follow-up email from Zoom that will include that link. And I will also, again, plug the fact that if you're someone working in the quality or regulatory testing sector in Canada, please consider joining the C45 Quality Association. We're always looking for new members, new volunteers. If you'd like to speak or present like Peter did today, just reach out. We just want to have this discourse and provide this venue to have these important conversations to get everyone aligned. So, you can join us as a member or just a volunteer as well. And again, finally, we're having a quality time session Wednesday, February 23rd at 5 p.m. Peter and everyone else on this call, please join. It's going to be an informal hour and a half long discussion with myself, Shane, and Deepak. All of us have been involved in releasing products in Canada that are related to vapes or inhalable products. And we'll be kind of tearing apart some of these proposed regulations that very likely we'll all have to adhere to in the next 6 to 12 months, whenever they do decide to be formally put in place. So thanks everyone. Have a great day, and reach out to the C45 Quality Association or Peter at Labstat if you have any further questions.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.